The city stood bright under the morning sun, its clean streets stretching between rows of white-painted houses. Cars moved smoothly, shops opened early, and modern life flowed with confidence. Yet beneath the shine, ancient voices still ruled. Elders sat outside their homes, leaning on walking sticks, watching life pass. Their words carried weight, heavier than money, heavier than law. In this city, buildings could change, but tradition never moved far. Among the people walking these streets was a woman whose steps were calm and measured. She was not born into comfort. Her childhood had been shaped by dust, hunger, and long days that ended with tired hands and quiet prayers. From an early age, she learned that strength did not always shout. Sometimes, it waited. She worked, saved what little she could, and listened closely to the lessons of her mother. Her mother once told her, "A pot that stays long on the fire learns how to endure heat." Those words stayed in her heart. Through patience, faith, and silent sacrifice, she rose slowly. She did not rush life. She did not compete with others. When blessings came, she received them quietly. When pain came, she carried it with dignity. She later met a man who seemed gentle, a man whose laughter came easily and whose promises felt warm. In the early days, he walked beside her, not ahead of her. He spoke with respect and listened when she spoke. The community saw him as a good man, shaped by hard work and ambition. When success found him, people celebrated him. But success, like sweet wine, changed his taste. As money grew, his voice grew louder. Advice from relatives filled his ears. "A man must be seen," they said. "A man must be feared." Slowly, pride replaced patience. The woman noticed the change but said little. She believed storms passed faster when one stayed still. Their marriage had once been a mirror for others. Neighbors spoke of them with admiration. Elders nodded with approval when they passed. "That home is built on unity," people said. They shared dreams, planned together, and faced struggles as one. Many believed their union was blessed by both heaven and ancestors. But whispers began to crawl into the home like snakes in tall grass. Relatives spoke of jealousy and control. They questioned the woman's worth and reminded the man of his position. Elders warned him gently, saying, "Do not let many hands stir one pot." He did not listen. The selfish voices were louder, and they fed his pride. The day the marriage broke came without mercy. The divorce was sudden, spoken in public, and carried shame like a drumbeat. People gathered, eyes wide, mouth silent. The woman stood still as words cut through her dignity. She felt pain, but she did not kneel. Her head stayed raised, even as her heart trembled. The man walked away believing he had power. He believed that because he provided, he owned everything. In his heart, he saw her as weak, as someone who would fall without him. As he left, he said coldly, "Remember who gave you everything." She watched him go, her face calm, her spirit unbroken. The city returned to its noise, but something had shifted. The elders exchanged glances. The wind carried an unspoken truth. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a test where pride and patience would soon meet again. And in that silence, fate began to move. After the divorce, life changed its face toward her. The respect she once carried like a fine cloth slipped from her shoulders. Doors that opened easily before now closed quietly. Comfort left her home, and security walked away without looking back. She moved through her days with only her name and her self-respect as companions. Some nights were long, filled with silence that pressed against her chest. Still, she refused to bow her head. When neighbors whispered, she did not answer. When pity followed her footsteps, she walked straighter. She remembered the old saying her grandmother once spoke by the fire, "When a bird loses its feathers, it still remembers how to fly." Even in isolation, she guarded her dignity like a sacred pot, cracked, but not broken. Time passed, and the man who left returned. His return was not guided by regret or peace. It was driven by hunger, the hunger to reclaim control. He believed the divorce had reduced her to nothing. Sitting among his relatives, he said with confidence, "I will go back and take what I gave her. She will beg. She will cry. That is how it always ends." They nodded, feeding his pride. He imagined her kneeling, her voice shaking, her strength gone. In his mind, Humiliation was already complete. Before the storm arrived, there was calm. The woman sensed it. She felt it in the way the air grew heavy and the way people avoided her eyes. Still, she remained quiet. Her silence was not fear, it was preparation. While he sharpened his arrogance, she held on to patience. Somewhere beyond human plans, fate listened. The day he came, his footsteps were loud. His clothes were sharp, his posture stiff with confidence. He stood before her like a king returning to claim land. "I am here for what belongs to me," he said coldly. "Do not make this difficult." Behind him stood his relatives, close and watchful, like spears aimed at one heart. A sister crossed her arms and said, "You should be grateful. Without him, you are nothing." An uncle added, "A woman does not keep what a man provides." Blood ties had turned into weapons, and family had become pressure. Then came the threats, spoken in smooth voices. Papers were brought out, names written, laws mentioned. "We will take this to court," he warned. "You will lose everything." Justice was twisted, shaped to scare rather than protect. Each word was meant to crush her spirit. People gathered as they always do when conflict smells strong. Neighbors paused their work. Elders stood at a distance, leaning on silence. Some watched with judgment, others with curiosity, many with fear of choosing sides. The woman stood alone in the center, calm as still water. She did not beg. She did not cry. Her eyes remained steady. And in that moment, as the man spoke louder and the crowd waited for her fall, the wind shifted. The story was no longer in his hands. And the ancestors, patient and watching, prepared the next turn of the tale. When the elders finally spoke, their words fell like heavy stones. They sat in a half-circle, back straight, faces firm, carrying tradition on their tongues. One of them cleared his throat and said, "A woman who leaves her husband must lower her head. That is the way of our people." Another nodded slowly. "Peace comes when pride sleeps," he added, though his eyes did not meet hers. She stood quietly, listening. Tradition, once meant to guide, now pressed down on her shoulders. No one asked what she had endured. No one asked how she survived. Wisdom had been buried under expectation, and submission was praised more than truth. Still, she did not argue. She bowed slightly, not in surrender, but in respect for age. Outside those gatherings, whispers followed her like shadows at sunset. Women spoke behind their hands. Men shook their heads as she passed. "She should beg," one neighbor said softly. "That is how a woman survives after divorce." Another replied, "Pride will leave her hungry." Shame tightened around her name, squeezing it in public spaces, yet she walked on. At night, memories returned without invitation. She remembered sitting beside her husband while his eyes stayed fixed on his phone. She remembered speaking and receiving silence in return. Love had not left suddenly. It faded slowly, like a fire starved of wood. Duty remained, heavy and constant. She cooked, she supported, she endured, while her voice disappeared one quiet day at a time. Yet beneath that silence, strength was growing. While others praised her husband's success, she learned to survive unseen. She studied, observed, and prepared. She learned patience not as weakness, but as armor. Like a seed under dry soil, she waited. She saved coins quietly, hiding them not from greed but from fear. She learned skills without applause, asking questions, watching closely, improving herself when no one looked. She prepared for storms she never announced, believing that tomorrow always arrives, whether invited or not. In her darkest moments, she remembered her mother's words. Her mother had once held her hands and said, "The river that flows quietly cuts deeper than the one that shouts." Those words lived inside her. They reminded her that force fades, but patience endures. One evening, an old woman stopped her by the roadside. Her back was bent, her eyes clear. She held her arm gently and said, "Child, justice walks slowly, but it never forgets the road." Then she smiled and moved on. That blessing stayed with her, wrapping her heart in calm. As the wind shifted and the air grew heavy with change, the woman lifted her face to the sky. She did not know how the battle would unfold, but she knew one thing: she was no longer empty. And somewhere beyond sight, Fate leaned closer, listening. When fear knocked on her heart, the past answered first. She remembered being a small girl, walking barefoot beside her father through dry fields. When she once asked why he never argued loudly, he smiled and said, "My child, dignity is heavier than gold. A man who carries it walks straight even when his pockets are empty." Those words returned now, warm and firm. They reminded her that wealth could shout, but dignity never needed to raise its voice. The lessons of childhood wrapped around her like an old cloth, worn but strong, shaping her resolve in the present moment. Across from her, the man watched and waited. He expected her silence to crack. When it did not, his calm began to burn. His voice rose, sharp and restless. "Why are you quiet?" he demanded. "Speak. Defend yourself." His frustration grew with every steady breath she took. Pride, wounded by her calm resistance, twisted into anger. He paced like a caged animal, unable to understand how silence could stand taller than his threats. Soon, greed took control of his tongue. Reason stepped aside. Insults poured out, careless and cruel. "You are nothing without me," he said loudly, so others could hear. "Everything you touch belongs to me." Wealth became his weapon, swung not to protect but to humiliate. Each word was meant to strip her down, to remind her of her place. Still, she did not move. His relatives joined in, surrounding him with hunger that had no end. "Take the house," one urged. "Take the land," another added. "Leave her with nothing." Even her dignity was discussed as if it were property. Family greed stood exposed, loud and shameless, asking for more even when enough had already been taken. Blood ties no longer meant care, they meant pressure. Then came the papers. Clean sheets, heavy words. Legal steps prepared not for peace, but for conquest. Names were written with sharp pens, laws bent like branches under selfish weight. "This is justice," he said, holding them high. But justice, twisted by desire, stood far away. The documents were weapons, meant to frighten, not to heal. Around them, the community gathered. Some leaned forward, waiting for tears. Others folded their arms, certain she would surrender. Society had seen this story before and wanted the ending it knew. A woman crying. A woman begging. A woman falling. The hunger for familiar tragedy filled the air. Inside her, fear whispered. Her chest tightened. Her hands trembled. But she remembered the river that flows quietly and cuts deeper. She chose restraint over rage. She lifted her eyes, calm and steady, and said nothing. In that silence, something shifted. The crowd murmured. The wind changed direction. And unseen, patient justice took another step closer. Quiet wisdom stood like a deep-rooted tree while loud pride danced like dry leaves in the wind. The man spoke first, his voice full and sharp, meant to fill every space and drown all doubt. He stood tall, chest forward, calling out his name and wealth as if they were shields. "I have power," he said. "I have proof. Who can stand against me?" His words echoed, but beneath them was fear, thin and trembling. Across from him, the woman remained still. Her strength lived inside her, calm and steady, like a river flowing beneath the earth. The elders watched closely. Among them, an old man whispered, "The drum that makes the loudest sound is often hollow." Slowly, the moral truth of the land began to rise, unseen but certain. Before the day of judgment could arrive, the spirit of each soul was tested. The night before felt heavy, as if the ancestors themselves were awake. The man could not sleep. He walked back and forth, anger wrestling with worry. "Why won't she break?" he muttered. "Why won't fear bend her?" Fate watched him with quiet eyes. Across the compound, the woman sat alone, breathing slowly. Fear knocked again, but she answered with prayer and silence. She remembered her mother's words, "Truth is patient. It waits until lies grow tired." In that waiting, something sacred stirred. The air itself seemed to whisper that dawn would not belong to pride. When morning came, the whole community gathered. People arrived from every path, young and old, rich and poor. This was not a day for secrets. It was a day when truth would stand naked. Elders took their seats, relatives lined the edges, and neighbors formed a wide circle. Eyes searched faces, reading hope, doubt, and expectation. Children climbed onto stones to see better. The dust beneath their feet felt alive, as if it remembered many judgments before this one. Murmurs filled the air, then fell silent. Everyone knew that once words were spoken here, they could not be taken back. The ground where they stood was sacred. It was where law met tradition, where old wisdom shook hands with modern authority. Papers lay on one side, clean and official. On the other side sat the elders, holding stories instead of documents. Pride stepped forward first, loud and confident, pointing to ink and stamps. "This is the law," the man declared. Tradition did not shout. It waited. One elder tapped the ground with his staff and said, "The law sees the hands. Tradition sees the heart." In that space, between paper and memory, between noise and silence, the truth prepared itself to speak. He stepped forward, chest lifted, voice ringing across the gathering. "Everything that I gave you, I take back," he declared, each word deliberate, meant to crush. Pride dripped from his tone, and mockery hid beneath the surface, like a snake coiled in the grass. "Do not speak," he warned. "You owe me respect. You owe me everything I built with my hands." His words were both sword and shield, claiming the right of a victor. The crowd shifted, leaning closer, some with curiosity, others with silent judgment, as if the air itself waited for her reaction. Greed made him bold. He believed that wealth, power, and the memory of her dependence still tied her to him. "Look around," he said, gesturing to the white houses, the streets, the life she lived. "All of this is mine. All of this comes from me. Do you think you can stand without it?" His tongue was guided by ego, every phrase sharpened to wound. There was no shame, no hesitation, only the arrogance of a man who thought the world bent at his command. Then silence fell. Not just ordinary silence, but a heavy silence that pressed against ears and hearts alike. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Even the wind seemed to pause. Eyes turned, fixated, moving from him to her. The community held its breath. The elders leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment carried weight beyond words. The streets, the compound, even the dust underfoot, seemed to wait. This silence was a drumbeat, warning and promise all at once. All eyes shifted toward her, the woman who had once been expected to crumble. The anticipation was sharp in the air, as if people were ready to see her kneel, to see the familiar story unfold. Tears, pleading, surrender. Mothers gripped their daughters, fathers straightened their backs, neighbors leaned on walls, all waiting for the collapse that had been rehearsed in their minds. But she remained steady, her head raised, her hands still, her calm a quiet defiance. In that moment, society's expectation met patience, and the first tremors of truth began to ripple through the crowd. The air changed when she lifted her eyes. Where the crowd expected trembling lips, where they imagined tears streaming and voices breaking, a smile appeared instead. Calm, steady, unshakable. It was a small curve, yet it carried the weight of unspoken battles, of nights endured, of dignity preserved. The murmurs began softly, then grew louder. Some leaned forward, puzzled. Others whispered to neighbors, trying to interpret what courage looked like in a single, serene expression. The man's confidence faltered for the first time. Why is she smiling?" he muttered, as if the world had shifted beneath his feet. That smile carried more than courage, it carried decades of patience. Pain long held in secret, labor quietly performed, and sacrifices unrecognized now stood proudly in her calm gaze. Every hardship she had survived now revealed itself in the curve of her lips and the steady hold of her hands. The crowd felt it. This was not defiance without reason, nor rebellion without thought. This was truth, tempered by time, and it shone brighter than any insult or threat he had ever spoken. She began to reveal the truths, laying them carefully before everyone. One by one, like sacred stones placed in order, each fact weighed on the air and demanded acknowledgement. Papers were unfolded, accounts opened, lists read aloud with dignity. Every contribution she had made, every hand that built, every sleepless night that nurtured growth, she placed them in the light for all to see. Noise, bluster, and pride no longer held power. The crowd quieted, leaning closer, sensing that justice was finally speaking. Evidence of her work emerged like sunlight through clouds. Ledgers, receipts, careful notes, all proof that she had been more than a witness to their shared life. Her hands had built what he now tried to claim. Her labor had grown wealth and stability, not only for herself but for the household he had once dominated. Each paper, each document, each mark of her careful work became undeniable testimony. And as they settled on the table, the murmur of acknowledgment rippled through the elders, the relatives, and the neighbors. The quiet strength of one woman, finally recognized, began to balance the scales that pride had long tilted. The truth began to shine in the open air, cutting through the lies that had once hidden in shadow. His misuse of power, the subtle manipulations, the whispered threats, all were revealed before the elders and the gathered authority. Documents, once locked away, were placed carefully on the table, each sheet carrying weight heavier than his arrogance. He tried to interrupt, to assert control with a raised hand and a voice meant to command, but the words fell flat against the undeniable facts. Lies, stripped of their protection, faltered and crumbled like dried mud under rain. Each paper told a story. Ledgers, receipts, agreements, and letters spoke louder than any shouted claim or mocking gesture. They carried justice in their ink and folds, revealing rightful ownership and the labor she had poured into the life they shared. Pride could not silence them, nor could ego erase the evidence. The documents moved like sacred messengers, each one a reminder that truth, though patient, could not be denied forever. The elders, once quiet and watchful, began to shift in their seats. Their eyes, trained to see beyond mere words, widened as recognition dawned. Authority awakened to what had been hidden in plain sight. Tradition, long bending under the weight of appearances, reclaimed its wisdom. Staffs tapped lightly on the ground as they exchanged knowing glances, murmuring in low tones that carried meaning deeper than any accusation. "We must see clearly," one elder said, voice steady, "for justice favors patience and truth." The crowd felt the change. Murmurs shifted, whispers became conversations, and slowly, sympathy began to move like a wind changing direction. Respect that had leaned toward pride and noise now returned to the woman who had stood silently, whose patience had been her shield. People nodded, heads bowing in quiet acknowledgment of courage and dignity. Some took small steps forward, as if drawn by the gravity of truth. Eyes that had once expected tears and submission now reflected wonder and admiration. Pride faltered, shrinking under the weight of collective recognition, while dignity rose, quiet and unstoppable, as the community witnessed the rightful balance restored. He had expected the moment to unfold as all his past victories had, loud, commanding, and unquestioned. But now, standing in the center of the gathering, surrounded by elders, neighbors, and those whose judgment he had once feared little, shock began to replace confidence. The arrogance in his stance wavered, his chest no longer holding the same prideful air. Papers, truths, and evidence, carefully laid before all, reflected a life he thought he had fully owned. And yet, here it was, undeniable. His power, built on pride and entitlement, was crumbling like clay beneath the relentless river of truth. His eyes, once sharp with expectation, widened as recognition struck. For the first time, he saw the quiet force he had underestimated for so long. She had endured without complaint, labored without applause, and built without seeking recognition. Every document, every testimony of her contributions, revealed a strength he had never imagined. He muttered under his breath, I thought," but words faltered because realization had arrived too late. The woman who had smiled calmly, who had faced his threats with silence, now stood revealed as the anchor of what he once claimed to control. Regret weighed heavily, a bitter and undeniable companion. Greed, which had once fueled him like fire in dry grass, now exposed him as weak. Each claim he made, each demand he shouted, rang hollow. The crowd, once silent with expectation of his triumph, now murmured in acknowledgment of her endurance. Arrogance, meant to intimidate, became his undoing. Witnesses of all ages and ranks saw that wealth and loudness could not overpower wisdom and patience. The scales of moral balance shifted gently, restoring what pride had sought to destroy. The very tools he had wielded as strength now illuminated his folly, a cautionary tale for those who would mistake greed for power. And there she stood, tall, steady, unwavering, yet not seeking revenge. Her eyes carried neither malice nor satisfaction at his failure. Instead, they reflected self-respect, dignity, and quiet triumph. She did not need to raise her voice to reclaim what was hers. Her presence alone spoke of victory. The elders nodded slowly, seeing that true power lay not in domination, but in integrity and patience. The community, once poised for scandal, now understood that humility could outlast arrogance, and that a woman's calm courage could shift the hearts of even the proudest men. In that moment, justice, patience, and honor had spoken louder than fear, greed, and pride ever could. The wind shifted softly through the gathering, carrying a quiet sense of change. He had expected to stand like a king, his voice commanding, his threats bending everyone to his will. Yet here he was, and the air no longer trembled at his presence. The woman, calm and unyielding, embodied the proverb that had been whispered in her ear since childhood, "The tree that bends survives the storm." She had bent under hardship, endured the whispers, the judgments, and the mockery, but she had never broken. Every glance, every measured step she took carried the weight of patience, of wisdom, of survival born in silence. The elders' eyes, sharp and knowing, settled on her. They had watched generations rise and fall, had seen pride crush men and patience outlast storms. Now, the moment had come for moral order to assert itself. The documents, the proofs of labor and sacrifice, the undeniable facts of her life, lay like sacred stones before all. She did not shout, she did not cry. She simply stood tall, a living embodiment of resilience and integrity. And justice, patient and quiet, moved through the gathering like a soft, unstoppable river. The man's face, once so confident, twisted as he felt the tide turn. His words, which had been weapons, were now meaningless. The crowd's murmurs shifted to acknowledgement, then to admiration. People who had come expecting scandal now watched reverence unfold. His arrogance had been defeated not by fury, but by the quiet truth of her life. The wisdom that had guided her through years of endurance now crowned the day. Her victory was not in vengeance, but in the reclamation of her dignity, the assertion of her worth. Every step she took, every calm gesture, spoke volumes, echoing the teachings of her elders. Strength rooted in self-respect surpasses the noise of pride. The crowd, once in awe of him, slowly turned away. Their fear dissolved as understanding and respect found a new home. Whispers passed like a gentle wind, carrying the message that arrogance is fleeting, while wisdom endures. His pride, once so mighty, was now exposed to the sunlight of communal judgment. Faces that had once bowed to him now looked past him to see the woman who had weathered storms and emerged unbroken. Public respect left him, drifting toward her, guided by the gravity of truth and integrity. Shame followed him as closely as a shadow under the noon sun. Every step he took echoed the weight of a reputation collapsing under its own hubris. The relatives who had encouraged his greed looked on in silence, seeing their complicity reflected in his downfall. The crowd watched quietly, for in African tradition, loud uproar was unnecessary when truth moved steadily. And the woman, serene in her posture, allowed them to see the beauty of patience and justice working together. In that moment, the moral of the tale settled over the assembly like a gentle rain. Wealth, pride, and aggression could be taken away, but wisdom, dignity, and integrity could never be stolen. Justice had arrived softly, unavoidable as the sunrise, and the community understood that it was not revenge that restored balance, but the quiet power of a spirit that refused to break. In the light of day, the man learned what many before him had forgotten. Strength without humility is fragile, while patience, rooted in character, endures all storms. The whispers that had once fueled his arrogance now fell into silence. Those who had urged him forward, who had sharpened their tongues with advice born of envy, retreated one by one. Faces that had once smiled at his boldness now lowered in shame, their loyalty revealed as hollow, their intentions exposed by the weight of truth. Even the relatives who had stood beside him, ready to claim what was not theirs, now shuffled away, shadows of their former voices swallowed by the dignity of the woman they had sought to humble. The air carried the quiet realization that false loyalty cannot survive when integrity stands tall. He looked around, the weight of his choices pressing like the midday sun. Where once there had been voices cheering his claims, now there was only emptiness. Isolation, sharper than any law, settled over him. Time became his companion, each passing moment a reminder of how greed had blinded him, how pride had turned into chains he could not break. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered, echoing against walls that no longer recognized him as master. Regret crept into his chest, heavy and unyielding, marking the difference between power taken and wisdom lost. Meanwhile, she moved through the crowd with a quiet grace, each step freeing her spirit from the weight of expectation. No chains bound her heart, no whispers could sway her mind. Her victory was not just in documents and court rulings, it was in the reclamation of self-respect, in the peace that comes from knowing that dignity cannot be taken by force. People stepped aside, some in awe, some in disbelief, as she walked toward a life rebuilt on her terms. The silence around her seemed to echo a universal truth. Freedom is not granted, it is lived, earned through courage, patience, and unwavering faith. Every corner of the city that had once seemed imposing now looked different to her eyes. She no longer needed permission to breathe, to thrive, to shape her own days. Small steps became milestones. Quiet mornings turned into moments of planning and growth. She planted seeds of a life built by her own hands, tending them with care, knowing that true independence blossoms slowly but surely. Her neighbors watched with respect, recognizing that this was not the triumph of revenge, but the triumph of patience, skill, and resilience. Each act of rebuilding carried the wisdom of her mother's proverb, "A woman who builds in silence commands a kingdom when the time is right." She reached her new home, a modest white house, freshly painted, bathed in the light of early afternoon. The walls were empty of grand displays, yet full of possibilities. She had taken nothing from him, yet she had everything: her name, her dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that she could endure. Inside, she began arranging the rooms with care, placing each item with intention, creating a sanctuary for herself and a future that belonged to no one but her. With every sweep of her hand and every step she took across the clean floor, she whispered to herself, "I am enough. I am free." Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place. Yet those who had witnessed the fall of pride and the rise of wisdom carried the story with them. In the markets, the streets, and under the shade of elders' trees, people spoke softly of the woman who had refused to bow, who had walked away not broken but stronger. Children learned that day that strength is measured not by noise, but by patience, that freedom is not taken by force, but by enduring trials with dignity. Even the wind seemed to carry the lesson, rustling leaves as if applauding her journey. In the evenings, she sat outside her home, watching the sunset paint the white walls in gold. Memories of the past whispered faintly, but they no longer held power over her. She had lived through shame, betrayal, and expectation, and yet she had emerged whole. Her hands, calloused yet capable, held the promise of new beginnings. The city, the community, the elders, they had all watched her walk this path. And in walking it, she reminded them of what African tales had always taught, that life's storms may bend the tree, but the roots of patience, wisdom, and courage will not break. And so, she began anew, not seeking approval, not craving recognition, but moving forward with quiet certainty. Each day was a testament to her strength, each action a declaration of self-respect. She had been tested, and she had endured. The man who had once sought to command her now faded into memory, a lesson in the futility of greed and pride. Her life, rebuilt patiently and deliberately, shone brighter than any house or fortune, for it was built upon what truly matters: freedom of spirit, honor of heart, and the unshakable power of a woman who refused to break. The morning sun rose over the city's whitewashed walls, casting long shadows across the clean streets. People gathered slowly, not out of curiosity alone, but out of respect that had quietly begun to grow. Where once whispers of pity had followed her every step, now admiration moved like a gentle wind among the onlookers. Faces that had once expected her to falter now held a glimmer of honor. Her name, once bent under gossip and shame, now returned to strength, carried on the whispers of those who had seen patience endure and dignity prevail. In the eyes of the community, the woman who had walked with silence now stood tall, unbroken, and finally acknowledged not for what she had suffered, but for what she had preserved. Her steps were slow but deliberate as she passed through the circle of neighbors and elders. The quiet example she had set spoke louder than words. Mothers nudged daughters, and young women lifted their heads, understanding without being told that strength does not roar. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking, "Mama, why does she walk so peacefully while others shouted?" The mother, eyes moist, whispered back, "Because she carried her heart like a shield, not a weapon. That is the way of the wise." Without intention, the woman had become a beacon, her calm endurance planting hope that no circumstance could shake. The elders, once quick to offer judgment and counsel born of fear, now felt the weight of their own silence. They murmured among themselves, heads bowed not in accusation but in reflection. "We forgot the balance of our words," said one, his voice trembling with the gravity of recognition. Another nodded, whispering, "Tradition is not only to enforce, but to guide. We spoke for the rules, not for justice." In this quiet turning, the community remembered its failures, its readiness to follow false appearances instead of honoring integrity. The lessons of patience, endurance, and moral clarity were written not in scrolls or law, but in the living example of a woman who had refused to bend in fear. Around the central circle, voices began to rise, not in argument, but in teaching. Proverbs, carefully chosen, floated from lips to ears like fire leaping from branch to branch. "The river that flows calmly carves the hardest stone," said one elder. "A woman who bends with dignity teaches a village," said another. Each saying carried weight, each repetition embedding the moral truth into hearts young and old. The people listened, rapt and silent, as the words settled in their minds and spirits. The stories of failure, shame, and human greed were transformed into cautionary tales, lessons to pass down, so that no woman, no child, no man would forget the cost of pride and the value of patience. From the crowd, someone stepped forward, a young woman, voice shaking but strong. "I will remember this," she said. "I will walk with the courage I see before me." A ripple of nods spread through the gathering. Mothers embraced their daughters, fathers adjusted their gaze from prideful assumptions to reflective attention. The woman who had once been expected to fall now silently watched as the community absorbed the lesson she had given freely, without a word of complaint. Her journey had transformed not only her life, but the hearts of those who had stood by, or stood against her, and had finally understood that dignity and courage could not be taken by force. As the sun began its descent, casting golden light across the white houses, the woman turned toward her home, unhurried, carrying nothing but her own integrity and the quiet knowledge of victory. Behind her, the circle of people lingered, repeating proverbs, passing wisdom as though it were embers of a fire to be kept alive. "A woman's patience outlives the storm," an elder said softly. "Strength is silent, but it teaches all who watch." And in that moment, the city, the community, and even the walls themselves seemed to acknowledge the truth. Power may be loud, but wisdom, patience, and self-respect endure beyond the tempests of pride, beyond the noise of judgment, and beyond the fleeting shadows of shame. The day ended not with fanfare, but with quiet understanding. Children learned from example, elders recalled the weight of their guidance, and the woman, walking through the streets that had once witnessed her trial, now moved through them as a symbol of hope and resilience. Her life, rebuilt without permission, without vindication sought, stood as proof that honor returns to those who never abandoned it. And so, her story joined the countless tales told around fires, in village circles, and under the shade of elders' trees. A story not of defeat, but of patient triumph, of dignity restored, and of wisdom quietly claiming its rightful place in the hearts of all. The streets of the city gleamed under the soft afternoon sun, the white walls of homes reflecting light like silent witnesses. Yet, behind the beauty of glass windows and tidy streets, lessons older than the city itself unfolded quietly. He had once believed that wealth was his shield, that money and status could bend the world to his will. But now, as he stood among the very people who had once bowed to his presence, he saw the truth. Coins could vanish, lands could be taken, houses could be claimed, but the wisdom that had guided the woman through storms, the patience that had kept her heart steady, could never be seized. She walked with dignity, carrying a calm strength that no arrogance could touch. The crowd observed in stillness, murmuring softly, as if even their voices feared disturbing the balance that had finally arrived. Their eyes, once hungry for scandal, now lingered on quiet triumph. "The river may dry, yet the bed it carved remains," whispered an elder, the words passing like gentle wind through the gathering. Indeed, the woman's silence, her refusal to plead, to shout, or to retaliate, had spoken louder than the man's boasting ever could. Her power was invisible to those who sought submission, yet undeniable to all who understood the weight of patience. He felt it then, the shattering of the illusion he had built around himself. Pride, once a cloak, now became a chain, heavier than the loss of any house or gold. His arrogance had blinded him to the quiet labor that had built the life he tried to claim, to the sacrifices and wisdom that had underpinned her survival. The lesson, harsh and unyielding, pressed on him like the midday sun. Pride is faster to destroy than poverty, and it leaves no wall to shield the fool who trusts it. His fall was neither loud nor dramatic. It was the gentle inevitability of truth asserting itself. Around him, the community felt the shift, the subtle but unmistakable return of balance. Those who had plotted shame and humiliation found their plans reflected back upon them. A cousin who had whispered for vengeance felt a chill of recognition. A neighbor who had stoked rumors suddenly realized that the fire they tried to kindle had consumed only illusions. The air itself seemed to affirm the principle older than the city walls. What is intended for harm often carries the seeds of its own undoing. The woman, untouched by the whispers or the subtle sneers of defeated pride, moved forward. She smiled not for victory over another, but for the triumph of endurance, patience, and self-respect. A child watching her from the edge of the circle asked her mother, "Why does she smile when so much was taken from her?" The mother, wiping tears from her cheeks, answered softly, "Because she knows that true wealth cannot be taken. Strength that lives in the heart and mind is untouchable." Even the elders, who had once questioned the silence of her struggle, now nodded in recognition. Words of wisdom, passed from mouth to ear like the sacred fire of the ancestors, carried the story further. A tree that bends in the storm survives, while the proud break in the wind. The woman had become that tree. She had weathered the storm, and in her calm, the community learned anew the value of patience, humility, and dignity. No courtroom, no council, no document could fully measure her triumph. It was written in the eyes of those who watched, in the hearts of young women who would now carry hope instead of fear. As she turned toward the path home, every step echoed with the quiet message that strength is not in loudness or domination, but in steadfastness, wisdom, and the courage to uphold one's own dignity. The man, alone among those who had once encouraged his greed, realized that power had slipped away like sand through his fingers, leaving only the bitter weight of regret. And so, the city absorbed the lesson, not through chaos or punishment, but through the serene, undeniable force of character. The woman's story became part of the oral tradition, repeated around fires and in the shade of elders' trees. Wealth could vanish, pride could fall, silence could be mistaken for weakness. Yet patience, wisdom, dignity, these endured, carried forward as the richest inheritance one could leave to the generations that followed. The moral was clear, etched not in stone but in living hearts. Those who seek to humiliate often face their own reflection, and true power lies not in taking from others, but in holding fast to what no one can ever steal, the integrity of the spirit. The sun hung low over the white walls of the city, casting long shadows that danced like silent witnesses to the story that had unfolded. In the open square, where so many had once gathered to whisper, judge, and expect tears, silence now held the air like a sacred drumbeat. The woman stood tall, her eyes steady, her shoulders relaxed yet full of quiet authority. She had walked through storms, endured the sharp winds of greed and the cold rains of betrayal, and yet here she remained, undiminished, unbroken. Around her, the community held its breath, recognizing at last that true power was not taken by wealth, nor demanded by pride, but lived quietly in the strength of character. The man, once feared for his voice, his confidence, and the trappings of success, now felt the weight of his choices pressing down upon him. Those who had encouraged him, who had whispered for him to take what was not his, had fallen silent. Their false loyalty now revealed, their faces betraying unease, they stepped back as the tide of justice, patient and relentless, settled over the gathering. Pride, that swift destroyer, had met its limit. Humility, long ignored, had returned to claim its place. An elder, leaning on a carved staff, spoke softly yet firmly, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "The river does not rush, yet it shapes the valley. So too does fate bow to the patient heart." The words rippled through the assembly, echoing the moral carried for generations. Character is the true measure of a person, and no arrogance can withstand its quiet force. The woman's eyes flicked to the man, no hatred there, only a calm that pierced deeper than any accusation or shout. Around them, the square seemed to pulse with acknowledgment. Young women, who had once whispered in corners about the helplessness of her silence, now drew breath in awe. Her restraint had spoken volumes. The community understood that silence was not weakness, that enduring dignity could outlast every storm, and that patience was a shield stronger than any sword. Even the gossips felt the quiet power that radiated from her presence, and they too learned that moral truth cannot be rushed, and cannot be. The man finally found his voice, a tremor betraying the certainty that had long guided him. I thought," he began, only to pause as the reality of his error settled in. No one offered consolation, no hand reached out. The laws of the land could protect property, but they could not restore pride, nor could they teach wisdom where it had not been sought. The woman, standing firm, reminded the assembly in the simplest of ways that all the gold and titles in the world were empty without virtue. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, one that held the memory of years spent enduring, learning, and building quietly. It was a smile that carried the weight of patience, the depth of self-respect, and the ultimate triumph of wisdom over desire for vengeance. The elders nodded knowingly, whispering proverbs that had traveled across generations. He who humbles himself endures, he who inflates his pride collapses. The children watching from the edges learned without words, absorbing lessons more profound than any decree or lecture. As the sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays catching the gleaming white walls, the woman began to walk away, unburdened. The steps she took were not just for herself, they were a path illuminated for all who followed, a living testament that character can bend fate itself. Behind her, the man lingered, shadowed by the consequences of greed and arrogance, and the community reflected, quietly and collectively, on the silence they had once accepted, on the judgments they had allowed, and on the wisdom that had always existed but only revealed itself through patient endurance. The story closed not with vengeance, nor with loud celebration, but with the soft, undeniable power of truth, dignity, and integrity. The moral was clear, echoing in the hearts of all who had witnessed. Those who act with honor may be tested, may suffer, and may be underestimated, yet patience and self-respect will always command the final word. Wealth may vanish, pride may crumble, but wisdom, patience, and character remain forever untouchable. And so the tale was told once more, in the language of the elders, carried like fire around the circles of the village and the city alike. Justice may be slow, but it is certain. Revenge is fleeting, but dignity is eternal, and in every heart that chooses character over greed, fate itself bows to the strength of the spirit. Forced.